The scorching sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty streets of Millbrook, a forgotten frontier town where hope came to die and dreams turned to dust. The year was 1887, and civilization felt like a distant memory in this godforsaken corner of the Arizona Territory. Wooden buildings lined the main street like crooked teeth, their paint peeling under the relentless desert heat, while tumbleweeds danced through empty lots where ambitious settlers once planned to build their futures. Jake Sullivan crouched behind a stack of grain sacks outside Hartwell's general store, his stomach gnawing at his ribs like a caged animal. At 12 years old, he had the weathered face of someone who had seen too much and the hollow eyes of someone who had eaten too little. His clothes hung on his small frame like rags on a scarecrow, patched and repatched until the original fabric was just a memory. 3 days had passed since his last real meal, and the gnawing hunger was making his hands shake as he watched the store's back door. The sound of breaking glass shattered the afternoon stillness, followed by raucous laughter that sent chills down Jake's spine. He knew that laugh belonged to Silas Crow and his gang of drifters who had been terrorizing the town for weeks. The sheriff had conveniently disappeared on business whenever Crow's men rode into town, leaving the decent folks to fend for themselves. Jake pressed himself deeper into the shadows as boots thundered past his hiding spot. Through a gap in the grain sacks, he watched as Crow emerged from the saloon, his black hat tilted at an arrogant angle, silver spurs jangling with each step. Behind him stumbled 3 of his men, bottles of whiskey clutched in their grimy hands, their faces flushed with alcohol and malice. "Well, well, well," Crow's voice cut through the air like a rusty blade. "Look what we got here, boys." Jake's blood turned to ice water in his veins as he saw what had caught Crow's attention. An elderly Native American man sat quietly on the wooden steps of the trading post, his weathered hands resting on a beautifully carved walking stick. His name was Joseph Crow Feather, and Jake had seen him in town before, always dignified, always peaceful. The old man's silver hair was braided with small feathers and beads, and his clothes spoke of a culture that had existed in this land long before any white man had ever set foot here. "Ain't you a pretty sight?" Crow sneered, swaggering closer to the elderly man. "What's an old savage doing in our town?" Joseph Crow Feather remained motionless, his dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the buildings, as if he could see through the veil of hatred to something pure and untouchable. His silence only seemed to infuriate Crow more. "I'm talking to you, you ancient piece of leather," Crow snarled, kicking dust at the old man's feet. "When a white man speaks, you answer." Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the scene unfold. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, to keep his head down like he always did. He was just a street rat, a nobody who survived by being invisible. What could a scrawny 12-year-old possibly do against 4 grown men with guns? But something in the old man's quiet dignity called out to something deep in Jake's soul. Maybe it was the way Joseph Crow Feather sat with such calm strength, refusing to be diminished by the hatred surrounding him. Maybe it was the memory of his own grandfather, who had died protecting Jake's family from raiders 2 years ago. Or maybe it was just the simple recognition of one human being's worth in the face of another's cruelty. "Cat got your tongue, Chief," one of Crow's men laughed, taking a swig from his bottle. "Maybe we should help loosen it up." The man raised his boot to kick the elderly Native American, and something inside Jake snapped like a dry twig. Before his rational mind could stop him, he burst from his hiding place like a cornered wildcat. "Leave him alone!" Jake shouted, his young voice cracking with emotion as he threw himself between the men and Joseph Crow Feather. The sudden appearance of the ragged boy caught everyone off guard. Crow's men stumbled backward, surprised by the interruption, while Joseph Crow Feather's ancient eyes widened slightly as he looked at the small defender who had appeared as if from nowhere. "Well, I'll be damned," Crow chuckled, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. "The little street rat's got some fight in him. What's it to you, boy? This your grandpappy?" Jake's legs trembled beneath him, but he stood his ground, his arms spread wide to shield the elderly man behind him. "He ain't done nothing to you. Just leave him be." "Nothing to me?" Crow's voice grew dangerously quiet. "Everything about his kind is something to me, boy. They're the reason good Christian folks can't live in peace on this land." The other men began to circle around Jake and Joseph Crow Feather like vultures sensing death. Jake could smell the whiskey on their breath, could see the mean glint in their bloodshot eyes. His mouth went dry as dust, but he didn't move. "You got about 5 seconds to step aside, boy," Crow growled, "before I decide you're as much of a problem as this old redskin." Behind him, Jake heard Joseph Crow Feather speak for the first time, his voice like wind through ancient trees. "Young one, you should not risk yourself for an old man. These are not your battles to fight." Jake glanced back over his shoulder and met the old man's eyes. In them, he saw wisdom and sorrow and a deep well of strength that had endured through decades of hardship. But he also saw something else, surprised that anyone would stand up for him, especially someone so young and vulnerable. "Maybe not," Jake said quietly, turning back to face Crow. "But somebody's got to." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Around them, the few townspeople who had been brave enough to venture outside during Crow's rampage now pressed themselves against storefronts and peered from behind curtains, too afraid to intervene but unable to look away. Crow's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "You got more backbone than brains, boy. That's gonna get you killed." He took a step forward, his hand now fully resting on his gun handle. Jake felt every muscle in his body tense, but he didn't retreat. He thought of his grandfather's last words to him before the raiders came: "Sometimes, Jake, standing up for what's right is the only thing that separates us from the animals." The moment stretched tight as a bowstring about to snap. Birds stopped singing. The wind held its breath. Even the distant sounds of the town seemed to fade away until there was nothing but the 4 men, the elderly Native American, and one small boy standing at the crossroads between cowardice and courage. Then Crow smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Jake had ever seen. "Well then, boy," Crow whispered, his voice like silk hiding a blade. "Let's see just how far that backbone of yours will take you." The silence stretched like a bowstring ready to snap. Jake's heart hammered as Crow's hand moved to his gun, death gleaming in the outlaw's black eyes. "Silas Crow." Marcus Hartwell's voice cut through the tension. The shopkeeper stood in his doorway, double-barreled shotgun steady in his hands. "You and your boys have had your fun. Time to move along." Crow's sneer faltered. "Didn't know you had it in you, Hartwell." "I sent my boy to fetch Marshal Davidson from Tucson 3 days ago," Hartwell lied smoothly. "Should be riding in any time now." The effect on Crow's men was immediate. They glanced nervously at each other, suddenly remembering consequences beyond this dusty street. Crow spat into the dirt and turned away. "This ain't over, boy," he growled at Jake. "Next time that fat shopkeeper ain't around, we'll finish what we started." The gang mounted their horses and rode toward the edge of town, Crow's parting words hanging in the air like a curse. "Your time's coming too, Chief. Mark my words." Jake collapsed beside Joseph Crow Feather, his legs suddenly weak. The old Apache studied him with unreadable dark eyes. "You did not have to do that," Joseph said quietly. "My people have learned to bend like grass rather than break like oak." "But that ain't right," Jake replied. "Just because folks done wrong before doesn't make it right to keep letting them." Something shifted in the old man's weathered face. "You speak with wisdom beyond your years, young one." He smiled, transforming his entire expression. "What is your name?" "Jake Sullivan." "I am Joseph Crow Feather of the Chiricahua Apache. You have shown kindness when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Such actions echo in ways we cannot always see." The old man rose gracefully, gripping his carved walking stick. "I must return to my people now. But Jake Sullivan, know this, true courage is acting despite fear. You have shown me such courage still exists." He placed a gnarled hand on Jake's shoulder, and warmth spread through the boy's body. "Will I see you again?" Jake called as Joseph walked toward the desert. "Some paths cross only once. Others weave together like threads in a blanket. Time will tell." That night, miles away in a hidden valley, Joseph sat before a council fire surrounded by Apache warriors and elders. Flames danced across faces marked by generations of struggle. "A white child defended you?" asked Standing Bear, a young warrior, disbelief in his voice. He stood between hatred and an old man he did not know, Joseph confirmed. Such courage deserves recognition. The eldest council member, an ancient woman with snow-white hair, spoke into the silence. If this is true, then the old prophecies may hold meaning. When the young wolf defends the old eagle, the circle shall be made complete. Joseph nodded slowly. Tomorrow, we must honor him as tradition demands. As the council fire burned lower, plans were made that would forever change the small frontier town. Jake Sullivan's simple act of courage was about to attract attention from forces beyond his imagination, and honor, once given, creates bonds that transcend the boundaries between worlds. Chapter 3, The Circle Complete. Dawn crept across the Arizona desert like a cautious animal, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded Jake of his mother's old quilt. He had spent a restless night in the abandoned barn, starting at every sound, every whisper of wind through the broken boards. His stomach gnawed at him with familiar hunger, but something else gnawed at him too, a strange anticipation that he couldn't name, as if the very air around Millbrook was holding its breath. Jake emerged from his makeshift shelter as the first rays of sunlight touched the weathered buildings of the town. The streets were empty except for a few early-rising chickens pecking at the dust, and the silence felt different from the usual morning quiet. It was the kind of silence that comes before thunder, heavy with unspoken promise. He was making his way toward the well behind Hartwell's store, hoping to wash the grime from his face and hands, when he heard it, a sound like distant thunder rolling across the desert floor. But the sky was clear, painted in brilliant blue without a cloud in sight. Jake paused, his head tilted, trying to identify the source of the rhythmic rumbling that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing moment. Then he saw them. They appeared on the horizon like a mirage made real, a line of riders moving with purposeful precision across the desert landscape. At first, Jake counted 20, then 50, then lost count entirely as more and more figures materialized from the shimmering heat waves. They rode in formation, their horses moving as one entity, creating a cloud of dust that rose behind them like smoke from some great fire. Jake's breath caught in his throat as understanding dawned. These were Apache warriors, more than he had ever seen in one place, their painted faces and feathered hair catching the morning light as they approached the town. Fear and fascination warred in his chest as he realized they were heading directly for Millbrook. The sound of hoofbeats reached the town before the riders did, and Jake watched as doors began to slam shut along Main Street. Windows that had been opened to catch the morning breeze suddenly sprouted wooden shutters, and the few early risers who had been moving about their business disappeared like smoke. Within minutes, Millbrook had transformed from a sleepy frontier town into a ghost settlement, every building sealed tight against the approaching storm. But Jake remained where he was, transfixed by the sight of the approaching riders. Something deep in his bones told him this was connected to yesterday's events, to his encounter with Joseph Crow Feather and the words the old man had spoken about actions echoing in ways they couldn't see. The warriors reached the edge of town and began to arrange themselves in a great semicircle that stretched from one end of Main Street to the other. Their horses snorted and stamped, but the riders sat as still as statues, their dark eyes scanning the buildings with the patience of predators. Jake counted them now, 100 warriors, just as the title had promised, each one bearing weapons and wearing the traditional dress of their people. At the center of the formation, Jake recognized Joseph Crow Feather mounted on a magnificent paint horse, his silver hair adorned with eagle feathers that caught the sunlight like captured fire. The old man's eyes found Jake immediately, as if he had known exactly where the boy would be standing. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Even the desert wind seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Then Joseph Crow Feather raised one weathered hand, and the warriors behind him began to move. They didn't charge or threaten or make any hostile gesture. Instead, they began to dismount with ceremonial precision, each warrior placing his feet on the ground at exactly the same moment, creating a sound like a single thunderclap that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Then, moving as one, they began to lay items on the ground before them. Jake watched in amazement as the offering took shape. There were beautifully worked leather goods, saddles and bridles decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to complete. Weapons appeared next, bows carved from seasoned wood, arrows fletched with the feathers of hunting birds, knives with handles wrapped in silver wire. Blankets woven in patterns that told stories Jake couldn't read but somehow understood were spread across the dust, their colors vibrant as jewels against the pale earth. But the offerings didn't stop there. The warriors brought forth jewelry crafted from turquoise and silver, pottery painted with symbols that seemed to dance in the morning light, and carved wooden figures that depicted animals and spirits with lifelike precision. Each item was placed with reverence, as if it were a sacred object being presented at an altar. Finally, Joseph Crowfeather dismounted and walked forward, carrying something wrapped in soft deerskin. He approached Jake with slow, measured steps, his ancient eyes never leaving the boy's face. When he was close enough that Jake could see the lines of wisdom and sorrow etched into his weathered features, the old man stopped and began to unwrap his burden. Inside the deerskin was a necklace unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The centerpiece was a medallion carved from what looked like black stone, but as Joseph held it up to the light, Jake saw that it was shot through with veins of silver that seemed to pulse with their own inner fire. The leather cord was adorned with beads of turquoise and small silver discs that chimed softly in the morning breeze. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather," Joseph said, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "It has been worn by the bravest warriors of our tribe for more generations than the white man has walked this land. Now it belongs to you, Jake Sullivan." Jake's mouth went dry as dust. "I can't take that. I ain't done nothing special enough to deserve something like that." "You defended an old man when you had nothing to gain," Joseph replied. "You stood against hatred when it would have been easier to look away. You showed courage when fear should have frozen your feet to the ground. These are the marks of a true warrior, regardless of the color of his skin or the blood that flows in his veins." The old man stepped forward and placed the necklace around Jake's neck. The weight of it was surprising, not heavy, but substantial, as if it carried with it the accumulated honor of all who had worn it before. The moment the medallion touched his chest, Jake felt a strange tingling sensation, as if something ancient and powerful had just awakened within him. "The offering you see before you," Joseph continued, gesturing toward the treasures spread across the street, "represents the gratitude of 100 warriors for your act of courage. Each man here has contributed something precious to honor you. Some gave weapons they crafted with their own hands. Others offered jewelry that belonged to their ancestors. All gave willingly, because courage must be recognized and honored wherever it is found." Jake looked out at the assembled warriors, each one standing proud and still beside his offering. Their faces showed no hostility, no threat, only respect and a kind of solemn acknowledgement that made his chest tight with emotion he didn't fully understand. "But why?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a nobody. A street rat with no family and no home." Joseph Crowfeather smiled, and in that expression Jake saw a depth of understanding that seemed to encompass all the pain and beauty of the world. "In our tradition, a man is not measured by what he owns or where he comes from. He is measured by his actions when the spirits test his heart. Yesterday, you were tested, and you did not fail." The old man turned to address the entire assembly, switching to the Apache language. His words flowed like music, rising and falling with rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. Though Jake couldn't understand the meaning, he felt the power in those ancient syllables, the weight of ceremony and tradition that stretched back through countless generations. When Joseph finished speaking, the warriors responded as one voice, their words creating a sound like wind through canyon walls. Then, moving with the same precision they had shown throughout the ceremony, they began to mount their horses. "Wait," Jake called out, panic suddenly gripping him. "What am I supposed to do with all this? I can't carry it. I don't even have a place to keep it." Joseph Crowfeather paused with one foot in his stirrup. "The offerings will be taken to the reservation and kept in trust for you. When you are ready, when you have found your place in this world, they will be waiting. The necklace, however, stays with you always. It will remind you that courage recognized creates bonds that cannot be broken." "Will I see you again?" Jake asked, the same question he had posed the day before. This time, Joseph's answer was different. "The path of the warrior is long and filled with many turnings. But those who walk it with honor are never truly alone. You will see me again, Jake Sullivan, in this life or the next. As the Apache formation began to move, Jake noticed that several of the younger warriors were gathering up the offerings, loading them onto pack horses with the same care they had shown in presenting them. True to Joseph's word, the treasures would be preserved, waiting for a future Jake couldn't yet imagine. The last thing Jake saw as the riders disappeared into the desert was Joseph Crow Feather turning in his saddle to raise one hand in farewell. The gesture was both goodbye and blessing, acknowledgement and promise rolled into a single moment that burned itself into Jake's memory like a brand. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, the town began to stir back to life. Doors opened cautiously, and curious faces peered out to see what had become of the boy who had brought 100 Apache warriors to their doorstep. Jake stood in the middle of Main Street, the ancient necklace heavy around his neck, feeling as if the entire world had shifted beneath his feet. Marcus Hartwell was the first to approach, his face a mixture of awe and bewilderment. "Sweet Mother of God, boy. Do you have any idea what just happened here?" Jake touched the medallion at his throat, feeling the smooth stone warm against his fingertips. "I think," he said slowly, "I think I just learned that sometimes when you do right by folks, the whole world changes because of it." From that day forward, Jake Sullivan was no longer just another homeless boy struggling to survive on the frontier. Word of his courage and the Apache ceremony spread through the territory like wildfire, carried by traders and travelers who had witnessed the unprecedented sight of 100 warriors honoring a white child. Some told the story as fact, others as legend, but all agreed on one thing: the boy who had defended Joseph Crow Feather had been marked by something greater than ordinary human experience. Opportunities began to present themselves. Hartwell offered Jake steady work in his store, along with a place to sleep in the back room. A traveling preacher, impressed by the tale of moral courage, offered to teach the boy to read and write. A rancher from the next county, hearing of Jake's character, suggested he might have a place for someone trustworthy to help with his horses. But perhaps the most important change was in Jake himself. The necklace around his neck served as a constant reminder that his actions mattered, that courage had value beyond survival, and that honor once given created connections that transcended the boundaries between different worlds. He walked taller, spoke with greater confidence, and found that the fear that had once dominated his life had been replaced by something far more powerful: the knowledge that he had worth. Years later, when Jake had become a successful rancher with a family of his own, he would still tell the story of the day 100 Apache warriors rode into Millbrook to honor a scared, hungry boy who had simply chosen to do what was right. And whenever he told that story, his hand would unconsciously move to the ancient medallion he still wore, a tangible reminder that courage recognized creates bonds that can never be broken, and that sometimes the smallest acts of human decency can echo through generations like thunder across the desert sky.